Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely, and I just want to do a short video on the subject of Ukraine, and in particular on the subject of money for Ukraine. As we've pointed out here at the Gaggle many times before, there is always money for Ukraine, and despite the weeping and wailing on the part of the doomsayers, or on the contrary, the celebrations on the part of those who are always predicting that Ukraine is about to collapse, the Western countries can always come up with some money for Ukraine. It's the most important thing in the minds of the leaders of the United States and the EU, and so they have to finance this. And as we spoke over the past few weeks, the European Union was having difficulty coming up with some money for Ukraine because Viktor Orbán was holding up the 50 billion euro donation to Ukraine because he wanted some money for himself. And though he was owed something like 30 billion euros and he got back 10 billion, he wanted all of it back. He wants the 20 billion euros. And without that, he really wasn't going to sign off on any money for Ukraine. So at the last big EU meeting, there was an impasse. No money for Ukraine. Why? Because of the 27 EU member states, one, Hungary, said no more money for Ukraine. And at the same time, in Washington, there is this ongoing debate, discussion, haggling, negotiations, whatever, between the administration and the two houses of Congress about a $110 billion package, of which something like $61 billion would be for Ukraine. The rest would be for Israel and supposedly for border security. But this haggling has been going on now for a few weeks, and nothing much is going to happen there until January. However, we fully expect that some money will be coughed up for Ukraine. That's what they do. That's what the members of Congress do. And since 90% of the members of Congress are very much in the tank with Ukraine and Zelensky, that 90% will prevail over the 10%. That's just the fact of life. 90% will always win out over 10%, unless that 10% were particularly smart, ruthless, clever, cunning, whatever, which this 10%, which are mainly Republican, Trumpian, MAGA supporters, they definitely are not. But back to the EU. The EU has apparently found a way to get some money to Ukraine. So there was the 50 billion euros that wasn't available, but they've come up with a new plan. And so the Financial Times today has run with a story that luckily, and surprise, surprise, there's a plan B about how to get this money to Ukraine. And apparently it involves guarantees from the member state to the EU budget. So the member states guarantee the EU budget. Sounds weird, but that's the plan B. So let's just take a look at this story in the FT today, because of course the FT is rejoicing that thank God this nightmare will not come to pass, the nightmare of abandonment of Ukraine. And so here it is, and says EU readies 20 billion euro plan B to fund Ukraine. It's not quite 50 billion, but still it's 20 billion. And, where they found 20 billion, I'm sure they're going to find another 20 billion somewhere else. So it says the debt-based scheme would sidestep Hungary to quickly release money for Kiev. So we're not going to negotiate with Viktor Orbán anymore. We're just going to, find some way of getting this money into the eager little hands of Zelensky. And so here's the EU is preparing a backup plan worth up to 20 billion euros for Ukraine, using a debt structure that sidesteps the objections of Hungary's Viktor Orbán about funding the war-torn country. After EU leaders failed to agree on a proposed 50 billion euro four-year package for Ukraine earlier this month, officials have searched for alternatives to save Kiev from the looming budget crisis if the bloc's differences cannot be resolved. So again, it's an extraordinary thing that for the FT, for the EU, and of course for the United States, this looming budget crisis is a huge crisis for us. Apparently that we have to make sure that Ukraine has money to tide it over, to address its budget crisis, so that it can go on fighting, so that it can go on shedding more and more Ukrainian lives for whatever purpose. So that's it. We've got to meet the budget, finance that budget, so that more Ukrainians are able to throw away their lives. That's the plan. Officials involved in talks said one model funded by debt has gained traction as the most practical way to provide support if Orbán refuses to drop his veto at the planned summit on February the 1st. And what is this plan? This scheme would involve participating member states issuing guarantees to the EU budget, enabling the European Commission to borrow up to 20 billion euros on capital markets for Kiev this year. So they're providing guarantees to the EU, which enables the European Commission to borrow on capital markets. So notice the European states and the European Commission are going to have to pay interest on this money that they borrow, and they're going to have to repay the principal because they're going to capital markets. You have to pay up. But Ukraine isn't going to pay up. So essentially, it's a transfer of wealth from Europe to Ukraine. I mean, this has been going on, of course, for almost 2 years, and then Viktor Orbán, who says, "Well, why are we doing this?" It's not like all the countries of the European Union are exactly brimming with money, chock-a-block with all sorts of goodies that they can afford to provide money for Kiev. But that's the thing. The Europeans, they're running up debts which they have to service. So the European Commission has to service its debts. The nation states have to service their debts. They're offering these guarantees, but Ukraine doesn't. So the arrangement is similar to the structure used in 2020, when the Commission provided up to 100 billion euros in cheap financing to EU countries for short-term work support schemes during the COVID pandemic. So that was a really great idea, because what happened then was, of course, a massive expansion of money within the EU, and led to this terrible inflation that's been a real burden on the European countries up to now. I mean, the inflation is still horrific in many European countries, including where I am, which is Hungary. So that crucially, the option would not require guarantees from all the EU's 27 member states, as long as the main participants included countries with top credit ratings. Well, of course, I mean, that's the whole point. You have to have the countries, because most of the EU countries don't have top credit ratings, so it's going to fall on the countries that have them. So, Germany can say, well, thank you very much, and Holland and the rest, hey, you wanted it, you can have it. That would allow the EU to sidestep Hungary's veto, because it would not require unanimous backing. No, it's just going to, they're going to shove this burden onto a few select European states. And then it says, if EU leaders agree on this plan on February the 1st, reassurance will be provided to the IMF to release its next tranche of funding for Ukraine worth about $900 million. So the IMF will release this money. Now, the IMF also wants its money back. Ukraine doesn't have the money to pay the IMF back. So again, the EU will be on the hook to pay back the IMF. The IMF again can't just simply be out of pocket. The IMF has to be paid back. So the EU borrows this money, gives this money that it's borrowed to Ukraine. Ukraine, of course, doesn't pay this back. But now that Ukraine has this money, the IMF releases further money, and then the IMF also needs to be paid back. And again, Ukraine isn't in any position to be paid back, to pay anything back. That should provide enough funding to Kiev to avoid having to resort to monetary financing, where the government would print money to sustain its deficit and risk inflation spiraling. So that's good. So thank God Ukraine will avoid the terrible inflation. The European countries, unfortunately, will not be able to do so. But again, notice all of the assumptions underlying this, that this is a huge issue for Europe. That the most important thing, this crisis, this ongoing crisis has been going on in Europe, is that somehow we're not able to come up with the money for Ukraine. And why do we need this money for Ukraine? So that Ukraine can go on fighting Russia, so that Ukraine and Russia can go on killing one another. This is the vital interest. This is why we need to come up with this money. Rather than think in terms of how do we end this war? Or no, we've got to find a way of continuing to bankroll this this horrific war. One downside of the scheme, when compared with the original proposal based on the EU budget, is that it would be limited to loans and not include grants. Yeah, that is a downside. I mean, because loans mean it has to be paid back. And since Ukraine isn't going to pay anything back, then essentially it falls on the European countries. I mean, it's going to be, it's coming out of their pocket. And it's not coming out of Ursula von der Leyen's personal pocket. She's, shoving the burden onto the Europeans. Not include grants, in other words, outright gifts. Member states could still decide to provide grants bilaterally. So thank God for that. They can still find ways of just simply handing over money. And again, the taxpayers, the European taxpayers, have no say in this. That's what's important. Who has a say in this? Well, the key figures in Brussels, and of course, the people who write editorials in the Financial Times. Oh, thank God. The last thing we want to do is ask European taxpayers whether this is a burden that they want to impose, whether they're happy about this transfer of wealth from them. Again, European taxpayers aren't doing that well. Transfer of wealth from them to Kiev. Another backup option under consideration involves rolling over the funding structure used this year, under which the EU provided 18 billion euros in cheap loans to Ukraine for a few months and up to a year. That's nice. This option would need a weighted majority of countries to agree. So it's a weighted majority. It means we don't have to have unanimity, and then we can skip over the obnoxious Orbán. But officials stress their preferred option is to approve the unaltered aid package first proposed in June, but blocked by Hungary. Of course, unaltered aid, just give them the money. And don't even bother to ask for anything back, just hand it over. Here, you hand it over, and then you got to, come up with ways to keep financing and paying all the interest on the loans. That top up to the EU budget, which remains the Commission's preferred arrangement, because it covers a 4-year timeline, also includes 4 billion euros for other priorities, including defense investments and migration. So that's good. That's another 4 billion. And so they found a way to get some money to Ukraine. That's really the main thing. So February the 1st is the next meeting. They're fully expecting that Orbán will be obdurate, because there's no way that the Europeans are going to give any more money to Orbán. They gave him the 10 billion euros, and this caused an outrage among all, pretty much the entirety of the EU Parliament, not just the Greens bloc who hate Orbán, but even among the sort of the center-right and center-left blocs in the European Parliament. They're absolutely outraged that Hungary got any of its money back, any of that 10 billion euros. So there's no way that Orbán's going to get any more money out of the EU. So they're going to have to find a way to get around the Orbán veto. And hey, this is Plan B. So European taxpayers, they'll get shafted. But the main thing, the most overridingly important thing, is Kiev gets its money. Kiev can keep this war going because it's some vital interest for Europe that that Slavs continue to slaughter one another. Anyway, that's the update. A cause for rejoicing in the Financial Times. It's a tragedy for everyone else, but as it was entirely predictable, there is always money for Ukraine. There's always a Plan B, a Plan C, a Plan D, and the same thing will happen in the United States. They will find a way to get money to Kiev. So thank you very much for joining me, and remember, if you like the gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.